Yes, so thanks very much, everybody, for coming and showing an interest in this topic. I realize that everybody in this room has got a very diverse set of backgrounds, so I commend your bravery for coming to this presentation. So I'm going to be talking about reframing water and food governance from ecosystem impacts to systemic human change. And I'm going to jump straight in to the presentation, which now won't move. Thank you. And the world as it is. So these sort of kind of apocalyptic types of graphs that we are constantly being exposed to. This is the numbers on the World Wildlife Fund's Global Living Planet Index from 2024, showing a 73% decline. We're all familiar with the Stockholm Resilience Center planetary boundaries and the disasters that they anticipate. But then paradoxically, we also have very significant levels of investment into environmental governance, environmental management, and so on. So what's going wrong? And that's part of the equation that we try to look at. And it suggests that despite the fact that we have skill sets that are appropriate to dealing with our planetary environmental challenges, we have the resources with which to do it, we're still not hitting the mark, all right? And this implies to us, at any rate, that we are confronted by very, very significant structural challenges. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is going to be focused on where we should actually be looking when it comes to trying to address some of these problems. Incidentally, I should also just say that we are currently working on what we're calling the Integrated Landscape Management Playbook. And a lot of this work is going to be covered in a fair bit of detail in there. And it was actually quite hard for us to decide how to pitch this presentation, given that a lot of what's contained within the ILM playbook is stuff that we are very excited about, and we've had to make trade-offs in terms of what we share and don't share at this moment. Okay. But I'll share with you our webpage at the end of the presentation. So one of the really key shifts that we focus on is that when it comes down to governance systems within the environment or governance systems within natural resources, we rightly characterize these kinds of relations as human ecological relationships or human ecological systems. However, this isn't an equal balance, all right? So the challenge, of course, is that we tend to try to embrace both dimensions of this challenge at the same time, but we think it's a much better idea to shove all of our attention over to the left-hand side of the screen. And that's where we think that the structural difficulties lie, all right? We have a very, very strong tendency to focus on the right-hand side of the screen. We want to go in there and parameterize the difficulties that we're confronted with in known ecological terms, chemical terms, topographical terms, whatever it might be, typically actually because that tends to simplify the challenge that we're confronted by. Messing around with human dimensions in these systems is widely considered messy, unpredictable, difficult, awkward, and frequently embarrassing. Yeah. So part of the reason why we look at landscapes is because this is where water and food governance happens, all right? We consider landscapes to be an appropriate platform, if you like, around which we can explore the dimensions of integration. Why does integration matter? Well, integration is often cited as being one of the key reasons why initiatives, interventions, and projects fail. It's remarkable how common we hear the refrain that silos developed during implementation and nobody was talking to each other. That is an incredibly commonly cited reason for why environmental governance initiatives fail. And therefore, as a consequence, and this is in many respects a significant rub within the work that we do, is that if we achieve integration across the human spectrum, then environmental governance dividends will be obtained, all right? We think that that's probably true, but actually the evidence isn't that strong necessarily, okay? And when we talk about and we think about these aspects, and here I'm concentrating on the idea of moving our attention into the realm of the human, what we're particularly focused on is power, all right? And power also is something that people are extraordinarily reluctant to talk about. And the reason for that, we think, has a lot to do with the fact that power is, frankly, ambiguous. A lot of the language around power, unless you're coming from the philosophical sciences, a lot of the language around power is underdeveloped. It's certainly not normalized within the context of our everyday academic conversations, all right? And so if you imagine that this circle, the yellow circle in the middle here is your landscape, typically we understand a landscape as a physical unit, a territory, all right? So we have a tendency to define the landscape in topographical terms. It might be political terms or administrative terms, a district, a country, or whatever it might be. Or indeed, most commonly is ecosystem terms or a biome or something like that. However, if you turn your lens to looking at the human dimensions, we are pretty insistent that a landscape is socially produced, all right? Fine, you've got your topography there at the beginning of the day. You've got the various hills and undulations or whatever it might be. You've got your different soil types and so on and so forth. However, what gets overlaid on top of that is entirely human produced, all right? If we take it a step further and we begin thinking about it in those power terms, then we might have, for example, nomadic youths working and operating and manufacturing the landscape from within the landscape. And we might have interactions between the women's savings collective here and those nomadic youths, again, within the landscape. But then what we also observe is that influence comes in from the outside. So in this particular case, we've got a corrupt provincial governor influencing the landscape, shall we say, from the provincial capital. We also have a corrupt national minister out here influencing into our landscape, all right? So this kind of explodes the territorial concept of a landscape, and it makes the landscape a remarkably amorphous concept, all right? So it really depends on where you decide to cut the cake in terms of drawing your boundaries around the landscape. But when it comes to the actual intervention, what is so useful about this approach is that it allows you then to begin thinking about who you're going to target and what are your associated strategies going to be, all right? And our counsel would absolutely be, is that if you do a kind of power mapping exercise and you're thinking about who is delivering the most influence within your landscape, potentially proximate to your landscape, or indeed at national or potentially international levels, then you can begin thinking about how you're going to target them with particular strategies that are going to influence what they do and how they do it. Right? Make sense? I see some nodding. It's very reassuring. Yes. Okay, so let's begin thinking about this sort of network. And here I'm going to get into a little bit into the systems side of things. Governance problems are not complicated, all right? This is a complicated schematic. They're more like a starling murmuration, all right? Complexity is something that a lot of people find intimidating. the main reason why complexity is so frequently regarded as such is because of the lack of predictability. Complexity insists on incredibly high levels of uncertainty. And so as a consequence of that, we advocate for the idea that those parts of your intervention that you can control, there is actually only one, and that is you. All right, it is you and your team. Arguably, your team is also complex, but nevertheless, your degree of controllability when it comes to the intervention itself is much higher than trying to insert yourself into a Starling memoration. Yeah. And that then necessarily implies that what we're trying to do is to design your team and how you implement your intervention in such a way that it is capable of navigating itself through a complex context. All right, and that is doable. Yes, it's very uncertain, but it is very doable. The other dimension that I'd like to introduce is this one around practices. And this is based on the work of Elizabeth Shove and her colleagues. The basic idea is that the practices are shared routine ways of doing things that people perform in their everyday lives. And every single intervention in any kind of environmental context, normally the arc that we see is that people will start by looking at the biophysical problem. We don't like the deforestation, we don't like the erosion, we don't like the flooding, or whatever it might be. Why do those things occur? Your next why then, of course, is going to be because somebody is doing something somewhere at some time, right? And those are your practices. We want to take that a step further, and we want to ask, well, why are they doing those practices? Because there's also a reason to that. And this is where, in our understanding of things, is that power really comes into play. All right, people do what they're doing very often for reasons of influence that has been imposed upon them on the one hand, but of course it's a two-way interaction. All right, you, CJ, have power. I promise you, you do have power, you have influence, and you have agency that radiates out from you, or ripples, to use a systems term, but equally so, other actors within your system are doing precisely the same thing. And where these two sets of influence, or fields of influence, meet each other, we call it an interaction zone. And that interaction zone is, we think, perhaps your most promising point of intervention when it comes to a complex system. Because if you change the nature of the relationship, you change the problem. Yeah. Ushova et al., they break these up into meanings, materials, and competencies. These are fairly self-explanatory. What I will say is that what you see in nearly all development interventions is that they will focus on materials and competencies, typically. All right, so materials are your classic development interventions. Bricks and mortar, these are your roads, these are going to be your irrigation systems, these are going to be your sewerage works, airports, etc., etc. All right? And then competencies are usually wrapped up in concepts like capacity building, and it's nicely measurable. You can report back that you delivered 25 training workshops on this particular topic. You had a bunch of field training schools, etc., etc. All right? But the meanings, on the other hand, are very rarely addressed. Typically, and it's almost tempting to say that the reason that meanings aren't addressed is because those are the ones that will actually deliver change. Meanings are profound, all right? They are a profound reason why people do things at a subliminal level. And they have to do with, so a really good example is that we have been doing it this way for 2,000 years. It is traditional. all right? There's a cultural reason for it. Our forefathers and foremothers did it, and therefore we do it, even if it seems like an incredibly dumb idea now, yeah? But meanings can also be, and this is unbelievably common in rural developing country contexts, is when you ask, why are you doing it this way? The response will be because we have no other alternative. And that is a profound powerlessness. To imagine that you don't have an alternative is also profoundly meaningful. And then the final comment on this slide is that if we follow Shove and her colleagues, you have to apply all three things at once. Otherwise, nothing will change. All three have to be addressed. Now, moving on to thinking about power. Very common in systems discussions are iceberg metaphors, mostly because many systems thinkers understand that typically we're only addressing the top of the iceberg, and we're very rarely addressing the underlying conditions and systems dynamics that feed that visible level, okay? And what we are concerned with here is that typically with development interventions, they are dealing with the visible power dynamics here. So here are your laws, your decisions, your formal rules, and your policies, that sort of thing. These are often cast then as being your most logical entry point, all right? And this in turn, of course, is a reflection of our understanding of how states ought to work, how modern government should work, all right? And so as a consequence, those are the kinds of things that we should focus upon, all right? Now, for somebody like myself who's worked in developing countries for far too long, the idea of focusing on policy is almost laughable, right? There's absolutely no sense in generating new policy within developing countries because it's meaningless. It doesn't make any sense to focus in that area. However, in Western countries, it does make sense. And so as a consequence, when it comes to ODA and you're imposing that in developing countries, then let's shove out the policy. And it's one of the key indicators of project success is how many policies that you actually manage to generate, right? I don't know if any of you are familiar with Stephen Luke's work on power. This is his sort of schematic. But where he then talks about is that hidden and invisible powers as well. The three faces of power, he calls them. What we're concerned about here is who sets the agenda. And this is actually profound. It's understanding who actually sets the agenda within a given context tells you something about the conversations that you are allowed to have, what is considered appropriate, what is considered right, and most importantly is what is considered important, right? So the rights of ethnic minorities, for example, are pushed off the agenda because nobody wants that to be given voice and therefore infused with any degree or level of importance. And then also what is considered possible, right? And so these then are fairly profound dimensions to how we understand power operating within the context of landscape dynamics, systems, and therefore governance. Now, one of the things that we've been playing around with is the idea of common pool resources, CPRs. Who's familiar with common pool resources here? You don't count. You're off the agenda. Okay. You are. A common pool resource is a resource that can only be managed in common by virtue of its characteristics. All right. So a really good example is air. Right, we can't manage air unless we do it collectively. Right, the climate is another one. Fisheries, as the image implies, fisheries are another very good example there, all right? But one of the things that we should bear in mind is that there are a lot of resources that don't necessarily have to be common pool resources, but which end up being managed in that way in any case. So you could have a common pool forest, which is then collectively managed by the communities who exploit it. You could have collectively or common pool land resources. Some of you may have come across Gareth Harding's very famous essay from 1960, whatever, The Tragedy of the Commons, where what he was looking at specifically there was grazing, communal grazing lands, etc. What we think is that it's very, very useful for us to think about power as a common pool resource, okay? Power is a resource, right? If you are empowered, you'd quite like some more power, yeah? If you want more power, you can buy it, ergo corruption. Yes, you can trade in power, yeah? And so then the idea becomes one where it could be considered ethical if we understood power to be something that should be shared responsibly, which is very, very often implicit in virtually everything that we talk about. It's unfair that so-and-so is doing this to me, right? That we evaluate ourselves in terms of how we apply our own individual power and so on and so forth, okay? So this is perhaps one of our more controversial ideas, is the argument that we should be treating power as a common pool resource. And there is a more recent body of literature that begins focusing on the idea of commoning, of imposing common ethics and common understandings on a diversity of resources so that we can achieve collective management of those resources together, and that we can all acknowledge our individual and mutual responsibilities when it comes to governing them. So our basic landscape model is this. We see the landscape as comprising these three key dimensions. The first of which is your system. Embedded within that, and I emphasize the word embedded, is power, and embedded within power is practices, all right? One of the difficulties that we have with a lot of our work is to try to remove from it the implications of hierarchy or priority, all right? We don't think that within the context of our landscape model here, you should be prioritizing practices over the system or vice versa. It's very important to be able to treat each of these equitably, for the main reason that most system dynamics can only be perceived if you don't prioritize, if you do not prioritize one element over another, right? Because so much of what happens in a system is not anything that you can anticipate. You've been trained to look at soils, and therefore you look at soils and you don't look at the birds. Yeah. And the other thing that we want to emphasize here is that there is a two-way relationship between them. And one of the simplest ways of understanding the relevance of power within the context of a system is to focus on its patterning capabilities. It patterns practices, right? It results in particular sets of practices emerging from the system as a whole, all right? And when we understand that it patterns, then power becomes something that we really should be paying a lot more attention to if we are going to be sincere about our responsibilities to environmental governance. And from this then emerges our concept of integrated landscape management, which does actually deviate from most contemporary definitions of it, but we see it as an intervention approach, all right? Here again, I'm taking you back to that emphasis I made earlier regarding the design of your intervention, right? Who populates it and what is it going to do and how is it going to conduct itself within an uncertain context? in landscape systems that influences power and practices to shift heading in integrated social ecological conditions. And here I introduce you to a new concept, is the idea of heading, all right? And this is something that we have had a lot of discussion about within our little group, is that does a system have a heading? Okay, and at the bare minimum is the temporal aspect of it. It is moving through time, and therefore at least it's got that dimension. All right, but our preference is to argue that when it comes to thinking about systems, if we imagine that this point here is now the present, and we say that the system is heading in the wrong direction, it makes sense for us to say that, or at least implicitly believe that, if we're then justifying an intervention into it. There's no point in intervening in a system when you think it's going the right direction. Yeah? So in which case, if we're standing here now, we're proposing an alternative heading, a new trajectory for the system. How do we do that? Yeah, that's when you begin to get into the really interesting aspects of how you design an intervention more effectively. All right, and this then becomes a shift. And if you are at all familiar with systems language, you will know that a shift is a key word when it comes to thinking about systems and how we can change them. But closely related to this is the idea of ripples, all right? We have a lot of hesitation with the idea of scaling, yes? We prefer thinking about ripples. It's part of the reason that if you were to get into our playbook, virtually every single diagram is concentric circles because it implies that rippling effect. And ripples are something that can be sustained by the intervention itself for as long as it is there. What do you have to do then to ensure that the ripples can continue to cascade outwards after you have left? All right? So systems language speaks of ripples, but if you are incredibly successful, it turns into a cascade. And a cascade is scary, all right? It's where you want to go, but it's a complex system, so you can't control it, yeah? And cascades can be extremely risky because of the potentials of unintended consequences. And there can be loads, all right? So that's why it becomes your risk mitigation or your concern for, do you want it to cascade? How do you limit the effect of that so that your cascade is in principle a mini cascade, which is kind of an oxymoron, all right? But at any rate, this idea of system shifting is very important. The other thing I should just introduce at this juncture is the idea of system states, all right? So most systems are in a stable state. That's how we describe it. It doesn't mean that it's devoid of any kind of movement. It has plenty of movement. However, the movement is restricted, all right? There's dynamic that sort of looks like this. But when a system shift comes along, you get something like this, all right? So when resilience breaks down, you may be familiar with that word. When resilience breaks down, you're getting a profound shift. You're also getting a cascade of the most scary variety. So when we shift that kind of language into the world of thinking about power, maybe we can typify different power states based on the idea that the state, the underlying concept here is how power is being distributed in that particular state. So perhaps the most chaotic situation is that you have violence, and so as a consequence of that, it becomes very, very difficult, but not impossible, to discern any kind of stability in that moment. Yeah. Whereas at the other extreme, we have our commoning idea, where we have very high levels of individual responsibility towards environmental context, and probably also quite high levels of predictability. Low predictability at that end, at the other end, quite high. And then, of course, if we overlay and we move in a clockwise direction, the more you move in that direction, you're getting closer to integration. In the opposite direction, you're getting closer to fragmentation. So each one of these substates, these are the sort of major states, each one of these substates helps us to then begin thinking about what kind of intervention that we're going to design. And then in addition to that, it also helps us to understand in what direction do we want the system to head. So if we're sitting over here and everybody's sulking, everybody's got their arms crossed, they don't want to talk to each other, we'd like to move it in that direction now. Okay, so what we do then is that we try to identify different levels of or types of interventions, which then render, and this is a really, really critical point, is to render the intervention fit for purpose. Okay, if your purpose is to move the system in that direction, you have to design for it. Okay, and what I will say about this is that this point about intervention design has become more and more apparent to us, all right? And one of the ways in which you can actually think about that is that if in principle, and virtually everybody we talk to agrees with this, okay? The environmental problem is there because people are doing this, all right? Therefore, we have to work with people, okay? Your conventional approaches are, okay, we're going to network. We're going to network widely. We're going to create networks all over the place, yeah? We're going to engage. A lot of people talk about engagement, all right? We're going to work closely, hand in hand with communities and so on and so forth. All of these buzzwords and the buzz terms that we hear all of the time. And then you look at the intervention team, and you've got a physicist in the team, and you've got a soil scientist in the team, you've got a chemist in the team. Why don't we have human-to-human capabilities within those teams? This, to us, is very perplexing. Yeah? So what we really should be looking for is people with what we call soft skills. We want to see the social psychologists there. We want to see the facilitators. We want to see the mediators and the negotiators and all these people. Yeah? Because they're the ones who are fundamentally trained in enabling new conditions to arise or emerge within the context of the system. And yet these skill sets are amongst the most widely sidelined in natural resources management. You only bring in the facilitator when you have a workshop. So I've been talking a lot about power, and a really, really key dimension of all of this is the idea of sensing, okay? And the reason why we talk about sensing is because, well, as the word implies, is that you're sensing something about the system. All right, it's gnawing at you. You thought you saw something, you're not entirely sure, but then I go and have a beer together with Greg, and I say, Greg, I thought I saw, or I thought I heard. Okay, and then that's embedded in your mind, and you're thinking about it for a few days. Then something else happens, and that confirms what you said or believed earlier. All right, you're feeling your way through the system. Okay, there are discrete methodologies, mainly developed by the corporate sector, around the concept of sensing. And what's novel about sensing is that you don't need to know everything about the system in order to derive useful conclusions about it. All right? It's the idea of appropriate imprecision. Okay? You don't have to know, and this is where it rebels against researchers, is that researchers normally feel that you have to know everything about something before you can act upon it. But in actual fact, everybody else in the world doesn't operate on that premise. Nobody does. Everybody operates on imperfect information, with the idea that in the event that you were wrong, that's okay. Right? So part of the thing that we talk a lot about within our playbook is the importance of failure and the need to elevate failure. And in fact, to banish the words success and failure, because everything is just a learning. Okay, we don't want that kind of language because it attributes grotesque pride or shame to either one of those extremes. If we can't address the system with equanimity, there's no point in getting involved in it. All right? So, and obviously, we think that power is one of the key areas that we need to apply our sensing capabilities to. So this is a real world example. This is from a project that we were working together with in Laos. They were working in 3 landscapes distributed throughout the country. And this is a methodology called net mapping. And basically what you're doing is it's a kind of stakeholder analysis. And basically what you're doing is that you're thinking about all of the stakeholders that you think have deliver some kind of influence to what the condition is in your landscape, why your landscape looks the way that it does. And then we are applying 3 dimensions to it. The first of which is a score out of 10 that indicates how powerful they are, how powerful whatever group you are consulting with, how powerful do you think that they are now? Okay, what would you like them to be in the future? Okay, so in this case, one of their key instruments were what they called guardian villages that played was the sort of delivery mechanism by which communities contributed towards conservation. In the future, they'd like to see them have 10 out of 10. Okay, but then we also have interest variables. Okay, and what that is asking is how interested are they going to be in your alt heading, your alternative heading that you defined earlier. All right, but this interest variable is particularly important because it helps you to begin thinking about what is the skin that they've got in the game. All right, and the more strategic that skin is, the more important that they become. Yeah, and obviously this it has to have a lot of iterations. And the other thing that this does is that you can begin to characterize the relationships between them, not merely because of the link between them, but because you can say, okay, well, in this particular case, this actor here has got power over that actor there. All right, you can also have a 2-way arrow, which is power with. And then obviously the inverse of this arrow here implies that one has got power under. All right, now that's a fairly limited set of variables by which we can then use to understand power dynamics. And we're trying to think through ways in which we can add additional richness to the way that we characterize those relationships. And this is fundamental to systems thinking overall, is that it's what we call the in-betweenness of things. All right, it is not merely that you've got actor A and actor B. It is the nature of the relationship between them that matters. All right, that is the really key thing. Okay, so let's take some of those strands of thinking and apply them to a real-world case. So the project that Khalil and I have been working on is called the Landscapes for Our Future program. It was a 100 million euro investment by the European Union. It comprised 22 projects in 32 countries. Basically what the EU did, they said that they wanted an integrated landscape management project, okay? And so each one of these projects answers to their respective EU delegation within whatever country that they're working in. And we had nothing to do with the proposals or the definition of ILM or whatever it might be. Okay, in fact, we were much more of an afterthought. It's a story of our lives. And so the idea is that the EU suddenly sat back and thought, oh my God, we better have some advisory functions within the program. And so we were invented after the fact to come and give advice to these individual projects. That, by the way, is our website where the playbook is going to be posted. All of the projects are within the tropics, and many of the projects, I should say, operate in very violent environments. many of the projects, and this was very interesting for us, are island states. Okay, Mauritius, Sao Tome, a few Caribbean states, Papua New Guinea, Timor-Leste. All right. So there you've got a very contained landscape. All right. If you walk too far off that landscape, you walk into the sea. All right. So that actually simplifies your job, but doesn't help you so much when you're operating in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And as I say, we had very little to do with how these projects were designed or how they were structured. So when we engaged with these individual projects, we kind of had to sort of cherry pick, all right? So when we were talking with them, we'd listen to them about what they considered to be their successes and what they considered to be their failures. These are the things that they tried, but it didn't succeed. Here are the reason why, etc. All right, and then we begin collaging. That's really our methodology, is to try to collage how all of this works in order to develop a theory about environmental governance and integrated landscape management. And the project that I want to focus on is being implemented in Kenya. All of these yellow areas here are the landscapes where they actually work in. They work across a massive area, over almost 64,000 square kilometers. And most of their work is concentrated in this dry land up here, which is still a huge area. Just some pointers about this in terms of formal power structures. You have your central government in Nairobi. Kenya has gone through a process of decentralization. We have counties in Kenya, and each county has its own government. They have been, because of the decentralization process, county governments have been empowered significantly, especially in their day-to-day role, and this is a key practice, is corruption, right? So that's something that they consider to be their reason for being. The project is being implemented by a Kenyan NGO called the Northern Rangelands Trust, NRT, and this was one of our key learnings for the program as a whole. NGOs are a much better partner than your big institutional actors like UN organizations, all right, in particular. And the reason for that is because they tend to be a lot more flexible, a lot more adaptable. They're allowed to pursue and make their own decisions and then to pursue those decisions, all right? And that flexibility is a critical element in successfully navigating complex systems. One of the areas that they have been particularly involved in is a tenurial condition under the Kenyan constitution, which allows land to be registered as a community conservancy, all right? And as the name implies, that suggests that communities can seek this tenure in order to manage collectively their natural resources. And at least on paper, that looks very attractive, all right? The idea then is that, okay, well, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about, we think that community management is a good thing. Let's pursue that. There it is in the Kenyan constitution. We run after it. And that's exactly what NRT did. And then we also have three very porous international boundaries. You've got Ethiopia up here, South Sudan up there, Uganda over here. The territory that is Somalia didn't really affect this project very much. The second aspect of this is that this is a hugely ethnically diverse part of the world, all right? So you've got masses and masses of different ethnic groups running around in this part of the world. They're all very patriarchal, okay? That means that men are elevated within those societies. And if you look at the men in these pictures here, you can kind of see that they themselves think that they are elevated within this society, all right? Because of this diversity, there's plenty of intercommunal tensions, all right? And these tensions I'll elaborate on in a moment. Cultures within there, again, this patriarchal dimension, really support raiding, all right? They encourage their young men to go out and raid neighboring communities, okay? But then at the same time, somewhat paradoxically, is that you've got significantly weakened community structures. So traditional ways of governing your community have been eroded by the state mechanism. So the primacy of the Kenyan government, the county governments, and so on, the very, very formal structures of government are in place, and those have then undermined not just for these communities, but nearly all communities in Kenya. And then the final thing I'll also say about this part of the world is that malnutrition is incredibly common. You've got extremely high rates of childhood malnutrition. As you will have judged, these are nomads, okay? And that is their principal preoccupation. They herd goats, sheep, cattle, and camels. And that means in turn that grazing and water are absolutely central to their livelihoods and what matters for them in their individual universes, all right? And this in turn means that they are extraordinarily mobile. Most modern governments don't like mobility, all right? That's why governments want to know where you live, what your home address is, why you need a passport to travel between borders, et cetera, et cetera. It's a key state mechanism, and it's one of the reasons why highly mobile populations are considered very suspicious by most governments. Think about the Roma peoples in Europe, but that's definitely the case for most of these nomads in Kenya. Access issues are common, right? And that what I'm referring to here is access to resources, or indeed access to rights, okay? Access is your doorway or your portal, if you like, between yourself and your betterment or whatever resource it is that you're looking for. Of course, an obvious one then is grazing, okay? If your grazing lands have been occupied by some other ethnic group, when you show up, that then becomes reason for war. But then access issues are also accentuated by colonial land acquisitions to the south of that territory, where you have a whole band of what are frequently very, very large former ranches, but now conservancies, all right? You have very little transport infrastructure in this part of the world, and you have a hell of a lot of humanitarian investment. So here you've got sort of donors that are piling in. Kenya's largest refugee camp is in northwestern Kenya, and they're piling in because of war in South Sudan, because of instability in southern Ethiopia, because of inter-ethnic warfare in northeastern Uganda, and they all come pouring in, all right? That introduces an additional instability into this particular system. When it's dry as hell, all right? But then when it rains, it gets really wet. And there's tons of rain, very, very significant climate change issues. Temperatures have increased by an average of 3 degrees centigrade over the past 10 years. And this squeeze, this climatic squeeze, increases every year, all right? The droughts getting longer, the rains becoming shorter and more intense. The area is crawling with wildlife, all right? And that then means that we have very high biodiversity values within it. We also have a lot of human-wildlife conflict, but it does mean that tourism values are potentially high, except that you have a negative relationships generally between tourism and instability, all right? But there are certainly parts, the more stable parts of this landscape where tourism has been able to flourish, in particular in these former colonial conservancies where the security is better maintained. So all in all, this is a very common sight up there, is your AK-47 wielding nomads. The AK-47 has assumed significant cultural relevance because you can pour sand into it, you can dump it in the mud, you can throw it into a river and it will still fire, all right? It's considered as a significant indicator of masculinity and progress in life. You also have very high violence-based mortality in this part of the world. It is the highest, the likeliest reason why young men die in northern Kenya is because they are shot. All right. This is a quotation from our project coordinator up there, which I thought was really very pertinent. The moment you bring order and structure, some people lose. There are those who benefit from the chaos, the beneficiaries of disorder. All right. And this is a really great insight into system dynamic. is that you really have to think about, it's actually very common within landscape studies is to think about trade-offs, okay? And therefore, if we conserve this part of land, does that mean that agricultural values are going to be diminished, all right? Nah, not so much. When it comes to power, you need to think that if we empower this group, who are we taking power away from? All right, that becomes highly pertinent. And in areas that are otherwise prone to disorder, stability is a threat to those who like it and who profit from it and who benefit from it. Yeah. So what did this project do? And there's a variety of variables that I want to touch upon here, and which have then spin-off implications for how this project performed. One of the things that they set up is COPAD. Khalil, what does COPAD stand for?
It was a collaborative MSP, right? Between the county governments.
County, I can't remember what it stands for. It was 4 counties, and they tried to create a kind of economic area, a tiny European Union in northern Kenya. What is interesting about this idea was that it came with a flourish, all right? It did what it did to the government agencies, excuse me, is that it made the government agencies feel good, all right, made them feel important, okay? This was very, very common across all of our projects, was to employ what we called a pincer movement, all right? Is that you need to do something to keep the governments off your back, all right? Making them feel good is a great way to keep them off your back. Yeah. They had very strong soft skills capabilities, all right? They inveigled themselves into negotiation and mediation. Out of the successes that this project talked about, it was nearly always their ability to get ethnic groups talking to each other. And talking was the variable, right? It wasn't peace. And I thought that was very interesting. Okay, it wasn't necessarily.
It's relevant. COPAD is cooperation on peace and development.
There you go. These groups could start, they could continue raiding each other, but for the Northern Rangelands Trust, if they were talking, that was already a major success. Okay? It's a bit like the US and Iran at the moment. And so this facility here, this capability was profoundly important for them in terms of how they thought about introducing new stabilities into the system. All right, was where they perceived stability as being via deliberation between these different groups, as opposed to their actual actions on the ground. They continued to raid, but then there was a mechanism where you could go and apologize to each other and do your mea culpas. All right, sorry, didn't mean to steal the cat. They had a bunch of material interventions into the system, especially around water access. Okay. These were different ways of harvesting water within the landscapes themselves, and indeed a lot of boreholes. Okay, and that was very important. It was also it also had significant symbolism for the communities that they actually work with. Right, water, the old cliche, water is life. Yes, that was definitely there. But it also encouraged new opportunities for communities themselves, especially if they could irrigate with it. But it could also, and this was one of the things that we were a little bit concerned about, it could also have consequences in terms of, for example, sedentarizing communities. And this is a part of the world where sedentarization has been over and over and over again been seen as a complete disaster. It's not an environment that tolerates you settling down. You have to keep moving. Okay. The project itself did not get involved in carbon markets, but NRT did. Okay. And this, again, was something that they spent 11 years on, and they managed to persuade the UNFCCC to include soil carbon as a key fundable within the carbon markets. All right. And the payout, the first payout that they actually got was very significant. I mean, it was over $1 million, and which they then distributed amongst the communities that were participating in that particular initiative. All right. So very, very positive. And in addition to that, they came up with a sophisticated way of distributing this with a clear thought for trying to prevent conflict amongst the individual communities that then received this money. All right. This was really important. So everybody got a little bit of money. Maybe you've heard of M-Pesa in Kenya. It's the mobile money method. You can send money to everybody's phone numbers. And so everybody got a little bit of that. And then there was a bunch of money that was set aside for social and community investments, like clinics and schools and that sort of thing. All right.
And just be right.
Yeah. Bureaucracy is something that we think they were unbelievably successful with. Here, we're not saying that they were very, very bureaucratic. What we're saying is that they provided a bureaucratic service to the communities, all right? And that was principally in the world of registering the lands as community conservancies, which in each individual case, like generated 50 kilos of paper. I mean, it was unbelievable processes that the Kenyan government put in place. And it's these kinds of mundane little things that so often create significant shifts in a system, all right? They were the ones with the computers. They were the ones with the English command of English. They were the ones who had the connections in government, all right? They're playing a mediating role in that particular context, right? And very often I have found as well in other instances is that bureaucracy is something that can really change things. Is that for a lot of rural people, they're intimidated by the government and they don't want to go there. And with good reason. Yeah, if somebody's willing to be a go-between, that can generate significant change. They also focused a lot on grass production. The idea being if you increase the grazing area, that will then reduce the conflict. Maybe. We'll have to see how that pans out. They included the county government, again, as a sop, as a way of saying, okay, county government, you guys are involved in our steering committee, leave us alone, all right? But within the NRT, they used community elders as the highest level in their organizational structure, which also is very interesting. They adapted like crazy, right? Constantly nimble-footed. But what you have to do is you have to weigh that out against contract changes with your donor. And that was probably the biggest stricture on their activity was donor commitment to the proposal and rigidity around the log frame, all right? And then finally, the idea that they saw themselves as an agent within the landscape. So that net map that I showed you earlier, we did that with dozens of projects within the portfolio. And what was amazing to us was that the projects never put themselves into the map, as if they had no agency, that they were a kind of ghost within the landscape. So I'm going to finish off with this thought. And this is the overarching guiding question to how one implements and engages with systems. All right? And it's who's doing what, where, when, how, and why, but with a key addition to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin.